So, to begin, art is another huge, complex, and wonderful venue for enchantment, and we will touch on some of the arts, one or more for each of our senses, while respecting the uniqueness of painting, music, and literature in particular. Here, the etymology of enchantment, to be in a song, comes into its own, with narrative as a particular hallmark. Yet here too there are powerfully disenchanting forces at work, especially stemming from and encouraging vulgar materialism. When we are enchanted, time radically slows down. We experience a moment of fateful wonder. We are in a particular place in a particular moment, as opposed to an abstract experience of space or time. And so this is important for art construed broadly, music, literature, I would argue some computer games. Any work of art can enchant, some more than others. And when we look at a painting, for example, it's the easiest example to give, we are transported to another world. It seems as if we are transported to another world. Of course, if we are in an art gallery, we are fundamentally rooted in a particular place, which informs how we experience the artwork, but at the same time we are drawn into whatever the artist is showing us, and the frame creates a difference. It reminds me of Foucault's Heterotopias, and quite fondly it reminds me of a story by Lord Dunsany, The Wonderful Window, in which a clerk, he buys a window and it shows him a vision of a past time. And so there's really this difference. You, the person, the viewer, are engaging in the work of art, and there is of course that liminal space, that gap between you and the frame creates that gap essentially, if I understand it correctly. And so you are at once inside and outside of the painting, that kind of liminal metaphoric place. Again, enchantment is created in the gap between these things. The enchantment of art is ontological again, that word ontological. It can change how we live, it can inform our lives, we bring something to the artwork, but the artwork, if I understand it correctly, can create new meaning, metaphoric truth, which is real truth in the sense of it's not purely epistemological, concerned with knowing. It's being as, if I understand that correctly. It's not simply a case of the person, the viewer, holding a meaning already within, perhaps in the unconscious. The work of art can actually create new meaning. It's not just something that you already hold within. Now, one of the key points that I find, it really kind of affirms my own appreciation of art, but also my weariness about certain types of art. We can argue that all art is enchanting, but some more than others. And Curry and others have said that art requires, in a sense, a balance between concreteness and pure imagination. In other words, it's figuration, the figurative, a balance between the figurative and abstraction. And personally, for me, and this is probably something I will get onto in the review, but I've always been more drawn towards older styles of art, which are generally more figurative. It's realism, essentially. Realism is something that I find more moving. You could argue that, and I think Curry does in certain pages of his books, argues that realism can be quite stale at times. It can be quite, especially in the 1800s, late 1800s, it can be quite, mere representation doesn't add anything to us, to the world, which is a key point. So I think I do value that. I do value the skill involved in, for example, I have a canvas of, I have a canvas of Monarch of the Glen by Landseer on my wall. And I would always tend to value that more than an abstract work, even if the deer, the subject of the deer, is portrayed more alive by being more abstract. I think I would still tend to value the I would almost call it the materiality of the work, in the sense that the work is it better portrays the animal. But I can completely see what Curry is saying about when we need a balance between the figurative and the abstract. And some of you may be aware by now, I'm not particularly enamoured by, I have quite a low opinion of extreme abstract art, people like Jackson Pollock, and I think I agree with Curry that this is not enchanting art, really not enchanting art. However, I will give some examples of work that, in my review, that Patrick finds enchanting, but I don't. And I think it comes down to a matter of style. Just to give a quick example, I absolutely love Monet. Monet's water lilies are fantastic. That's not pure realism, but it's not pure abstraction either. It leans more towards abstraction, but it's absolutely masterful in the best sense of that word. But I dislike most of Matisse and other works that other artists that he mentions. But I will go into this a bit later on in my review. The modernist perspective on art, which is a program to always be new, to always be breaking frontiers and to scorning tradition in a way. And that, the modernist viewpoint, I should say, this is very important. It's not simply modern, it can be confusing. Modern work can be enchanting, but modernist is a willed program of disenchantment. Modern works are simply contemporary works or near contemporary works that are enchanting, but they're not driven by a particular philosophy, and that philosophy of disenchantment is the modernist outlook, which, again, Jackson Pollock, Damien Hirst, people like this, which I will talk all about this in my review, but it's art that is driven by a purpose, and that purpose usually is actually to break rules and to be ugly for ugliness' sake, to shock, which is another aspect I will get onto in this video. But again, the difference between modern and modernist. Any program in art is really detrimental to enchantment. It doesn't need to be this kind of deconstruction, this modern idea of deconstruction. You could argue that, and shock and ugliness and breaking rules and whatnot, you could argue, in fact, that a return to, a willed return to tradition and beauty and sticking to Greek classical ideas of beauty just because they are old and worthwhile, that is itself a program. And of course, as people like Scruton and Burke and Oakeshott would say, the best traditions are traditions that move with the times, but they retain what is good. Which actually brings me on to another key point about enchantment. Enchantment is a non-modern experience. Enchantment is not anti-modern. Again, referring back to the valorization of tradition over anything else, or the breaking of tradition over anything else. It's a non-modern experience, which implies that not restricted to any particular point in time. When you're experiencing enchantment in art or any other aspect of life, you are there in the moment. you are thinking about the past is brought to you. You hold the past within yourself, I think, but you're fundamentally within that moment. It's a non-modern experience. It doesn't depend wholly on the past and tradition, but it's not the enchantment of modernity. You are enchanted in spite of modernity, if I'm wording that correctly. So I have spoken largely about art here, but of course the etymology of enchantment, to be in a song, enchantement, means to be in a song. And music really is where enchantment it comes into its own. We are transported again. It's a moment of transcendence again, but not transcending away from the world. It's bringing us deeper into our reality, the place where we already are. And so the same kind of rules, if you can call them that, apply here with music. And in terms of disenchanted music, well, Curry's opinion is that, again, we need structure, but not so much structure. But in terms of disenchanted music, he argues, for example, that John Cage, the composer, is fundamentally, his music is disenchanting in the sense that it's atonal. And I agree with this. Music needs structure. And Patrick says as well that he finds Wagner disenchanting. And I understand what he means by this. Because, again, enchantment is a moment of delight. And so, to be bombastic, to be raucous, and it's actually entering that Apollonian mode where things are extreme. That can be disenchanting. And Patrick gives, I believe, some examples of enchanting music, and it's not music that I'm overly familiar with, but jazz is an enchanting choice for him. He says that the playfulness of jazz, for example, is very enchanting. Although, again, that can extend into highly freeform styles, but I will get into more detail in my review. Lastly, and most importantly, I think, for me, literature. Now, this is a very, very big topic, but suffice it to say, literature is most enchanting when we are ourselves, but not ourselves, which should be a recurring theme. Literature is best when we can enter a world and forget ourselves to an extent. The key example will, of course, be Lord of the Rings. Tolkien well knew the power of story, the etymology of enchantment again, to be in a song or in a narrative, any narrative. For Patrick, examples of stories that are enchanting are stories that, and I largely agree here, stories that are not mired in a sense of modernist irony and detachment. They are not overly cynical. And I do agree with this in structure as well as in terms of voice. A good example of this, and I will probably mention it in my review, is the difference between Italo Calvino's The Baron in the Trees and his later stories, where he fell into the postmodernist trap of technique over story, that sort of thing. If On a Winter's Night a Traveller comes to mind, whereas Baron in the Trees is a simple story about universal meaning, and just letting yourself go, experiencing the adventure is the best way to describe it. But of course, there's a lot more subtlety than that. There's magical realism, which kind of plays with fantasy and reality, and certain postmodern techniques can be enchanting. The metafictional aspect can be enchanting, but up to a point, I think. So that's really the key idea here with the enchantment of story. And I will just finish by saying that, again, to be in a song, to be in a narrative, it's very important, Because we seem to be forgetting that we live in a beautiful and storied world. This world is a narrative. So I hope I've given you a better idea about what art means for enchantment and what enchantment means for art. It's all about bringing something to the art and being changed by the art. Because art can make life worth living.
An experience of the enchantment of an artwork or some particular art changes your understanding of yourself, and because self and world are inextricably linked, also changes the world for you, changes the world that you are living in slightly but significantly. So ultimately, the enchantment of art is I believe, what a philosopher would call ontological. It's not merely epistemological. It's not merely about knowing, but it's about being, or how one lives. And of course, that sort of degree of enchantment in art and in any other domain is not common and does not happen all the time. But it does in fact happen sometimes. A black and white pen wash painting of called The Six Gentlemen, which are pine trees. The six gentlemen are six pine trees on a promontory with some water in the background, and then even further in the background, some mountains partly misted out. And for some reason, I just kind of fell into this painting, or perhaps slightly more precisely, found myself in the painting. I felt like I was standing on the promontory among the pine trees. And yet, and I was in the painting. That should remind you of enchantement, to be in a song. I was standing there looking at the distant mountains in the painting. And yet, of course, I never completely lost awareness of the fact that I was standing in a room in the Grand Palais in Paris, looking at the painting from the outside. So I was simultaneously inside and outside the painting. And of course, that also should remind you of the paradox, the kind of paradox that results from metaphoric truth. And if you want to destroy the enchantment, you follow the logical procedure, rather like an algorithm, of going, well, which is it? Were you inside the painting or were you outside the painting? You can't be both, because it's a contradiction. That's how to destroy the enchantment. If you want to work with the enchantment, you suspend that kind of question or that kind of judgment and say, yes, to all intents and purposes, I am at this moment inside the painting and I'm outside the painting. If you want to think about it, that would be the way to go. The song took me into the heart of where I already was. So it opened to my imagination the nautical, the maritime nature of the song, such that when your imagination, if it's given stuff, and this is an important point about art, if your senses are given too much, it doesn't leave any work for your imagination to do. If the senses aren't given enough, it leaves too much work for the imagination to do. If you can get the balance just right, then the imagination has a very important role to play. And what is that role? It's to uncover in your mind circumstances that are implicit in the situation you're in, the concrete magic, maybe the past that got us into that room in London on that evening, maybe the future that would unfold from it, maybe other places like the sea, for example, that because of that song came into the room and were implicit in the room. So in some way, I would say where I was carried away to was the heart of where I was already. By the way, you say to them something like, by the way, did you know that last year 1 million people read The Lord of the Rings? Like, practically, this is appalling. This is this is just the sort of reminder they don't want, that people can still be enchanted by something which from their point of view is completely regressive, reactionary, primitive, superstitious. And incidentally, notice the interesting lineage of the word superstitious. It was originally an insult, a Protestant insult against Catholics, who were regarded as little better than pagans by the Protestants. The Catholics probably regarded the pagans the same way. Now the Protestants are applying superstitions to the Catholics. Then the scientific materialists apply it to all Christians or all religious believers. Oh, they're superstitious because religion is nothing but superstition. Now we have the modernists applying it to people with, popular taste, and I haven't said enough about this, who love stories, for example. Modern literary fiction is very nervous about story as such. Enchantment is enchantement, to find yourself in the story, in the narrative. If there's no story, you're not going to find yourself in it. Okay. But story. That's a bit primitive, isn't it?
So what you've been saying, Patrick, about beauty and sort of world disenchantment is very relevant to my question. Now, I don't want to be programmatically anti-modernist, but it seems to be that most modern art appears to operate under the assumption that, again, as you said, beauty is suspect.
Mm.
Contemporary artists of a certain ilk seem to think that the world is ugly, so art should reflect that by being shocking and crude. For
Mm.
example, phallic statues and fecal public art
Mm.
installations and
Mm.
whatnot.
Mm.
In terms of architecture, we obviously have
Mm.
drab tower blocks, sterile glass towers, artless exercises in technical proficiency, this sort of thing, garish vanity projects as well.
Mm.
We seem to have lost, again, that sense of beauty, and our built environment doesn't really recall the natural world or cultural achievement either. We seem to denigrate achievement and that kind of cultural striving. We kind of lose a sense of the world. It's funny, it's actually a self-fulfilling prophecy because the more ugliness that we create, the uglier the world becomes. And people, I'm not entirely sure what the logic there is. It seems to be a kind of world program of disenchantment. I'm not entirely sure
Yeah.
in service of what control, efficiency, and just the last little note that I had here, taking a note from Tolkien's Escape of the Prisoner. I've often likened this kind of situation to a prisoner scratching profanities and kind of hateful images onto his cell wall
Mm.
instead of pleasant thoughts or images. So
Mm.
instead of carving trees, birds, and fire, for example, on his cell wall, he writes again, he scrolls profanity. That's what we seem to be doing, at least with the really extreme examples of kind of phallic statues and whatnot. I'm not entirely sure why we've gone down this route. We seem, as Roger Scruton said, we seem to have lost our sense of beauty because we don't really understand what it means anymore. So
Mm.
just wondered if you had any thoughts on all of that. Cheers.
Yeah, I mean, of course, let's not forget that beauty can be appropriated or misappropriated to um, to ends that are not admirable. It can be used to enforce, for example, enforce gender stereotypes. Obviously, um, because nothing is perfect or nothing is without its dangers. If you look at the history of visual art, you find, at least in modern times, which is the only parts I know very well, there was a fluorescence of enchantment and beauty um, in the Belle Epoque, either side of 1900, which was obliterated by the First World War. In Impressionism in the 1890s and early 1880s, 1890s. Art Nouveau is another example. None of these periods last very long, and they all seem to come on the stage do their flourish, and then they're gone again. And perhaps that's not surprising with their emphasis on beauty, and perhaps that's not surprising insofar as, as I said, this absolutely doesn't cohere. At best, it's completely irrelevant to a program of what did Saruman offer Gandalf? Knowledge, order, power. That's what he tried to tempt Gandalf with. That's the modernist program, and so and of course the people in power have never wanted for supporters, for apparatchiks, for people who just will go along with it because perhaps they will get more power, or at least they will feel safer. So perhaps the real question is, how have we managed to have any beauty at all culturally? That's a really good thing. We should be pleased about that. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered your question, but there we are. Starting to equate an anti-beauty stance with loss of hope. Yeah. Just don't lose hope yourself if you can help it. Because the potentiality for beauty is always there, I would say.